It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this, our first public event. Thank you for joining us. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Kelly Grieco, I wanted to say a bit more about the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program, which aims to strengthen U.S. foreign policy by testing assumptions, reassessing conventional wisdom, and exploring innovative approaches to international engagement. Our team comprises a wide range of perspectives, but we share a commitment to expanding the foreign policy debate here in Washington, D.C. and beyond. Given the historic nature of the challenges facing policymakers in a rapidly changing world, we believe that the voices influencing policy decisions are often too narrow and that unconventional thinking is urgently required. Our overriding goal is to inject fresh thinking and unorthodox ideas that leverage all instruments of U.S. power and influence, including through trade, cultural diplomacy, and cultural exchange. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our page here at Stimson or send us a message. Now, with that out of the way, it's my honor to introduce my colleague, Kelly Grieco. She's a senior fellow here in the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program and the organizer and moderator of today's event, Exploring the War in Ukraine and the Future of Air Warfare. Kelly is a leading voice in this field, having explored the implications of the Ukraine war for air dominance versus air denial. I commend her for her innovative work and thank her for her leadership. Over to you, Kelly.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Chris, for that very kind introduction. And good morning to everyone. Thank you to our panelists for joining us this morning and to our audience for zooming in. Just a quick reminder that to please put any questions you may have for the panelists in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can later in the event. For the last month or so, Russia has pounded Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure with missiles and Iranian-made loitering munitions. And these attacks have caused significant power and water outages in many Ukrainian cities, leading to fears that Ukraine faces a dark, cold winter. And we have here today three really superb panelists, experts in this area to discuss these challenges and how we may understand this change in Russian strategy and the implications for the war in the months ahead. Let me start by introducing Margarita Konayev, who's the Deputy Director of Analysis and a Research Fellow at Georgetown Center of Security and Emerging Technology. She's an expert on Russian military innovation, as well as the military applications of robotics and artificial intelligence. Thank you for joining us. We also have Tom Carrico, who is a senior fellow with the International Security Program and director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is an expert on airborne threats, particularly missile threats, and also air and missile defense systems. Finally, we have Samuel Bendit, who is an analyst with the Russian Studies Program at CNA, and he is an expert on Russian defense technology, particularly uncrewed and autonomous systems. Thank you to all three of you for joining us this morning. To get us started, I want to ask you really the same question to all three of our panelists, a very general question, which is, as you're watching this new barrage of Russian airstrikes, how do you understand this change in Russian strategy? And do you think these attacks could change the course of the war? In other words, what does our audience really need to understand about what's happening right now? Tom, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, hey, thanks, Kelly, for moderating, and thanks as well to Chris for hosting and kicking off the event. I'm actually over in Europe right now for the Multinational Missile Defense Conference, and I'm sure the topics we talk about today will be discussed over here at some length. You know, I think in the first comment here is that we're really witnessing a remarkable case study on the potential strengths and weaknesses of complex and integrated air and missile attack. And there's a lot of lessons here and observations to make, and lots of folks are making them. It's worth, I think, situating our discussion today in the context of the Biden administration's new missile defense review, part of its national defense strategy. I remember when the last MDR came out in 2019, a lot of folks were jumping up and down about how great it was. And I felt like I had to be the skunk at the garden party to say that, you know, it didn't quite measure up to the scale and urgency of change required. And in fact, it was kind of misaligned with the Trump administration's own national defense strategy. It wasn't sufficiently focused on Russia and China, and it didn't have attention to things like mobility and distributed operations, integration, and yes, air defense. The 2022 Missile Defense Review actually addresses several of those shortfalls, at least at the level of theory, with lots of attention to counter UAS and the like. We'd say the first observation about the Ukraine is just the demand signal for air defense of different ways to contest and counter air superiority. It's President Zelensky's #1 refrain, right? There's a new report out from some of our friends at RUSI in London about just taking the next step, that if they do not get sufficient munitions, sufficient SAMs, that could portend another darker chapter in the war if Russia is able to operate in the air uncontested. The second big observation is that all of this air defense that the United States, from Stingers on up, has been sending, as well as lots of other folks, is taking place under a nuclear shadow. And it wasn't that long ago when folks would kind of get all hot and bothered if anybody dared to put air and missile defense in the same sentence as Russia. Provocative and destabilizing and all that stuff. In fact, you may recall some clucking going on when the Obama administration had the temerity to send over a single Patriot launcher, no missiles, mind you, but just a single Patriot launcher to Poland. In fact, I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is a lot of stability and a countering of the provocations with this active air defense. Another big takeaway is the importance of distributed operations, including for the air and missile defense elements themselves. Some reports suggest that 75% of the fixed site SAMs were in fact destroyed in the first week of the February conflict this year. But those that were moved, be they depots or AMD things, those that were moved, in fact, had a better chance of survival. This is a good, I think, indicator of the value of the distributed operations that the United States military services have been developing for the past number of years. It also is a reminder of the challenge of integration. It's one thing to talk about the desire for everything to be integrated, but it's really tough in practice. And it's certainly tough when you try to piece together and kludge together Spanish Hawks with German Iris Ts and American Stingers and all this kind of stuff. It can be done, interoperability and lots of information sharing, but it is a challenge. Another major thing I want to highlight here is numbers, is mass. Bill LaPlante, I would say the Undersecretary for ANS and the Biden administration, has been especially vocal on this subject. So much of the reason we were able to do anything here in terms of helping the Ukrainians with Stingers and Javelins is we had them lying around in mass in a barn somewhere. And if we didn't have that stockpile, then we probably wouldn't be able to help much. I think it's Chris Preble who's frequently remarked on the need for our allies to step up and do more. And that's why I'm gratified that the likes of the Japanese, the Australians, and a number of other folks are going after munitions, be it Tomahawk, SM-6, JASSM, so on and so forth. That's, I think, a very good thing. I was glad to see a couple of weeks ago that the State Department approved Finland's acquisition of some 400 HIMARS, which is in addition to their already considerable artillery forces. It's curious to me why anybody, let alone a senator from the great state of Missouri, might want to vote against the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO. The Finns are certainly showing what it takes to deter. So look, the Biden administration's critical munitions fund is on the chopping block. We'll see if that makes it through. But I think I'd like to suggest here at the end, the Biden administration should learn from the mistakes of its predecessor, and as well as its own first year. And what I mean there is what you might call munitions minimalism. I remember being told that the handful of javelins that the Trump administration sent over were supposed to be a deterrent. Of course, it was not. To paraphrase the late Senator Moynihan, that's kind of defining deterrence down. And so that munitions minimalism, I think, should be a cautionary tale for this administration, for future ones. That critical munitions fund proposed by this administration is a good start, but I think it's going to take more. In fact, I'd suggest it will take a strategic munitions reserve on the part of the United States for ourselves and for our allies. Let me just pause there. I think we're going to have lots to discuss. And again, thank you for having me on.
Great, thank you very much. Sam, how do you understand recent events in Ukraine?
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for the Stimson Center for bringing us all together. Really appreciate being part of this panel today. I will concentrate on the Russian fielding of Shahed 136 and 131 loading munitions. There's been a lot of discussion of whether or not these are actual kamikaze drones and whether we should be using that name or not. So I'll just stick with the loading munition. This actually shows to me the relative adaptability of the Russian military and its ability to turn around its capacity in a short amount of time. Once it became clear that Russian capacity is not enough, Russian domestic capacity is not enough to strike and attack Ukrainian key targets, that the Russian defense industry has not manufactured a large number of combat unmanned aerial vehicles to go after Ukrainian key positions, both military and civilians. And once it became clear that the Ukrainian integrated air defense is powerful enough to negate any significant Russian advantage in both manned and unmanned aircraft systems, Russia actually turned to its ally. And here we have to acknowledge that the world of drone manufacturing is actually rather diverse. It is rather capable and spans well beyond the well-established norms and principles that were laid out by UAV world leaders like China, United States, and Israel years ago. Iran has been able to manufacture a relatively light and cheap system. The actual numbers vary as far as the cost for each Shahed 136. I've seen numbers as low as 10,000 and as high as 50,000, but the average cost of a $20,000 loitering drone made almost entirely with civilian components and with light manufacturing that could be easily replicated in Russia and in other countries really shows the ability and the capacity of a determined adversary to go after very specific goals. In the Russian military doctrine, going after civilian economic targets of the adversary is actually fair game. It is one of the ways to bring the adversary to heel. It is one of the ways that Russian military wants to control the situation and force its own set of conditions. By going after economic and civilian targets, it would be possible to put pressure on the adversary government and force them to the negotiating table one way or another. And so Russia actually was rather capable in very swiftly turning to Iran, and Iran delivered a very large number of unmanned aerial vehicles, the Shahed 136 and 131. It possibly delivered the kits that Russia assembled together under its own name, the Gerain 1 and Gerain 2. Now, obviously, their capability is also very limited. These are not very fast UAVs. They're very low, they're very slow, but they do have a low radar signature, and they have very few metal components when compared to other UAVs. So they could be technically hard to track on the radar. At the same time, Ukrainian air defenses are capable at this point to go after anywhere from 60 to 90% of these UAVs. Of course, the whole point of Russia launching waves and sort of mass use, I'm going to stay away from the word swarm because I don't think it's an actual swarm. I think for this conversation, it's probably better we use the word mass, but we can discuss it later. Mass attacks actually were able to penetrate Ukrainian air defenses because all it takes is for one of these UAVs to actually make it through. And the fact that Russia wants to go after Ukrainian power plants, electricity, water purification, water delivery systems, and that type of civilian infrastructure as we are heading into a very cold and unforgiving Eastern European winter shows that Russia is shifting its tactic. As its military is getting pressed on the battlefield, and as Russia shows very limited capacity to conduct long-range military UAV strikes, it is going after Ukrainian civilian targets with easily acquired components from Iran. There have been a lot of discussions on the Russian Telegram channels and social media whether Russian defense industry is capable of manufacturing these on a very large scale. It is likely that in the long term, they probably will be able to. The numbers which are announced of Russia acquiring anywhere up to 2,000 of these Iranian Shahed drones is probably correct in the sense that these are relatively easy to assemble and are made up of civilian components which Russia can also acquire on the global marketplace. It is difficult to police and interdict these components, making it to a country like Russia. Obviously, Iran has demonstrated the capacity to acquire these components over the last several decades and put them into their rather extensive and capable drone lineup. So probably heading into the winter, probably for the next several months, Russian military is going to continue using these Shahed 136, 131 strikes. If it's clear that they're not going to have an effect on the Ukrainian people, on the Ukrainian population and on the Ukrainian government, Russian military may shift its strategy and try to go after some of the Ukrainian military targets. At the onset of Russia using Shahed 136 and 131 drones, there was information that these drones went after some military targets like howitzers, artillery, and even armored vehicles. So Russia may adjust some of its tactics and concepts and goes after some of the Ukrainian military targets. Of course, this was a very significant bellwether for the Russian defense industry. The fact that prior to the war, Russia was able to manufacture light ISR drones and some of the heavier combat drones, but really miss out on this long-range loitering munition market is a demonstration of some Russian capability and a demonstration of its very significant gap on another. Russia's own loitering munitions have a range of about 40 kilometers, and multiple social media videos of Lancet and Kub drones striking Ukrainian targets are demonstrative of this short-range approach, but again, showing Russia lacking a specific capability and a gap that they're going to fill with imported components. This shows that countries in the midst of a war can actually turn to willing partners and acquire technology rather quickly and rather easily that they're lacking in the long term. This shows that Iranian drones may actually proliferate, much like the Turkish Bayraktar drones are probably proliferating right now, based on the lessons and the exhibition in Ukraine. And as someone who watches Russian defense industry, it would be curious to see whether some of the Russian short-range capabilities can actually step up and provide more tactical capacity for the Russian military as it continues fighting in Ukraine going into the winter. And I'm talking about short-range tactical quadcopters that Russia is acquiring from the commercial online marketplaces like the DJI drone and DJI Mavics, as well as Russia's own defense capacity to manufacture something similar and deliver to its forces and to their allies commercial style quadcopters for light tactical duties, which have become absolutely essential and the lack of these drones have exposed a very significant intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance gap in the Russian military, as evidenced by its recent loss around Kharkiv. So I think I'll stop at this point and again highlight the fact that Russian defense industry and the Russian military still have an opening with Iran to procure more technologies and to launch them against Ukraine.
Thank you, Sam. Rita, I'll turn to you now. What are your thoughts on sort of the recent changes we've seen in the Russian air approach?
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you for Stimson for having us and to my co-panelists for getting us started. And I think really covering this topic already pretty extensively. So I'll be really quick. I think the evolution of Russian air warfare, the strategies, the targets, the means by which it's executing its, efforts are essentially a reflection of the evolution of the war itself. The initial failure of Russia to achieve its broader strategic goals of attaining a quick defeat. That air campaign, the initial air campaign, the use of really expensive cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, few of them with the expectation that they will yield grand results really quickly right in the beginning, reflect grand goals and ill-conceived ambitions that inevitably failed with the Ukrainian resistance and the way that the population and the military and the West that it's been helping held steadfast. With the transition several months into more of a dispersed, cheaper strategy of targeting the population and energy infrastructure. I think the air campaign, once again, reflects what's happening on the ground, what's happening more broadly in the strategic space. And it's the fact that Russia does not have the initiative in this war. This is different from to say that it's failing to adapt, which I think Sam did a really great job in illustrating the different ways that Russia is adapting to this continuous loss of initiative. But that is very different from saying that Russia's been able to gain and maintain an initiative in this war, whether it's on the air or in the ground. So what it's doing right now is what Russia does, unfortunately, best, and what it's also doing on the ground, and that is targeting the population. with the hope that the erosion of morale in the population will manifest itself in Ukrainian battlefield accomplishments. This is an all-out war for Ukraine. And in that sense, the population is fundamentally important, not only in the morale that it maintains, but also in who the Ukrainians are able to draw on for their, to actually mobilize forces. We're at a point where almost the entire male population is one way or another on the front lines, and a great deal of women are involved in the fighting, in the supply of additional capacity, and even we hear about efforts to train women as drone operators. So this is a full-scale mobilization of the entire population, and the state of that population is fundamental to the success of the Ukrainian campaign. And Russia is well aware of that, and Russia is well known for targeting the population precisely for these reasons. The final thing that I would say, because you asked us in the beginning, whether these Russian attacks or Ukrainian defenses against Russian attacks could change the course of the war. And I'm skeptical, because this is fundamentally still in the end a ground war because of the occupation of territory. Because Russia has been occupying Ukrainian territory, this war does not end until there is some sort of a resolution of that problem on the ground and the regaining of Ukrainian territory, or some sort of a settlement that is acceptable for the Ukrainians, the demilitarization of Crimea, perhaps, for instance. But because there is the occupation of territory involved, until that is resolved on the ground, of course, the air dimension matters and is important, but it is not the principal or even the most important for the ending and the resolution of the conflict. So I'll stop here.
Excellent. So before we go sort of and drill down a bit on more of the specifics at the operational level, I just want to go back a little bit to the strategy level question, which is, looking at these attacks, I think most of us look at them and see sort of a traditional kind of punishment campaign, meaning that they're targeting civilians to try to raise the costs of continued resistance, hoping in some way that they could break Ukrainians' will. And which is interesting in the sense that historically, these kinds of attacks don't work. We think of the Battle of Britain, for example. But I want to ask you a little bit to think of it a little differently and ask, is there a potential military effect of these attacks, particularly on critical infrastructure like energy? So, for example, one of the things I've wondered about is by disrupting electricity, for example, the challenges it creates for even running Ukrainian air defense systems. They now have to be run on generators, and to the extent that you're able to maybe disrupt the supply of fuel for those generators, are there potential military applications in degrading Ukrainian capabilities, or do we think that's a bit of a stretch? And whoever wants to sort of take a shot at that.
Well, Kelly, I can jump in. Early on in the war, probably just several months in, there were already calls on Russian Telegram channels and social media for the Russian military to go after Ukrainian infrastructure to prevent the shipment of weapons and systems from NATO and the West to the Ukrainian military. And a lot of commentators very publicly criticized Russian military hands-off approach from doing so. They wondered why the Russian military wasn't going after Ukrainian infrastructure earlier. In fact, they used rather graphic language describing what the Russian military was doing versus what it was supposed to be doing. And so this isn't necessarily a new approach. It has been probably forced upon the Russian military by the circumstances and by the conditions of its force. And perhaps people in Russia and even in the Russian MOD are aware that such punishing campaigns may not work. But even if they work just a little bit, if they degrade the capability somewhat, I think is what the Russians are thinking about. They want to buy themselves more time to reorganize, re-equip, and rearm their mobilized forces. And therefore, all targets, and any Ukrainian targets in this scenario, are probably fair game. Hence, we're seeing the intensification of this campaign against the Ukrainian civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, I would just jump in here as well. I think I think, like Sam, I see this most recent waves of attacks with the Iranian loitering munitions, but also all the cruise missiles and this sort of stuff, as frankly, principally military. Yes, there's the terror aspect of this, but the infrastructure, the energy, you better believe it, that has a very tactical and military application here. And here let me also, in answering this, I think, pick up where Margarita left off in terms of, is air defense necessary, perhaps not sufficient. And I do hope it remains a ground war in some extent, because it will remain a ground war until the air defenses are depleted, at which point Russia will be able to bring, I think, a lot more to bear than they have been. So we certainly hope that the air defense thing will keep it that way. So I'll just leave it there, I guess.
Great. So I want to drill down a little bit more on sort of the air war itself, particularly over the last several weeks. And Tom, let me start with you. And, Sam mentioned that the Ukrainians are reporting about 60 to 90% success in intercepting these drone attacks, the Iranian-made drones, and also missile strikes from Russia. And I'm just curious, as an expert in missile defense, what you make of those numbers, if they surprise you at all. And, I think just to help people understand why this challenge is particularly difficult, given the variety of airborne threats Ukraine's facing right now.
Yeah, so look, those are some big numbers. I think there's a lot of uncertainty here. Air defense is hard. Cruise missile defense is very hard. Defense against maneuvering, quasi-ballistic, Iskander type things is extra hard. So I'm hesitant to kind of weigh in terms of the percentage thing. I think let's not fixate on that too much. We are seeing a lot of reports, and even if you just put aside the reports, just go with kind of your the occasional video of calibers, for instance, or rotary wing helicopters, things like that getting shot down. And so it kind of picks up where I left off earlier, which is air defense isn't going to win the war for you, but the lack of it could lose it pretty quick. And so it's having an effect, I would say, just by contesting and countering Russian aerial forces. Let's hope that doesn't go away. But that's a pretty important ingredient. And it doesn't have to have a super high PK kill percentage to be able to have that effect. If it deters certain activities or the freedom of action in over the Ukrainian in the Ukrainian skies, that's a pretty good effect. And so everything from the Stinger to anything that they can throw in from Spain, Germany, the Poles, etc., to S-300s rolling in from Slovakia or Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, etc. That's all for the good, and it's having a deterrent effect on Russian freedom of action in the skies, and that's a good thing. Great.
Rita, a question for you, which is, Sam rightly mentioned that we're seeing sometimes in the media reports that, of Iranian swarms, or Russian swarms of Iranian-made loitering munitions. And as he noted, these are not probably swarms in the real sense of the term, meaning that they communicate with each other. But I am curious, just leaning forward a little bit, if you think if they were more autonomous, these kinds of systems, if it would change, how it might change the problem set for the Ukrainians. And, if there's anything we can kind of maybe learn thinking about the future here.
Sure. So I think we're at a point where perception has essentially become reality, where we are already talking about swarms, even if perhaps the technical definition of swarms is reliant on connectivity that is enabled by autonomy or artificial intelligence, where these units are able to communicate with one another independently, essentially, and then decide on how to move, how to aggregate, how to disaggregate, and where to go. What we're seeing right now is contingent on the fact that they're all remotely operated. They're still run by people, whether the people are close by, nearby, or in a different, in a different country like Russia. So they're still being flown essentially by remote operators, even when they are congregated together in what appears to be a swarm. So you ask whether that actually matters, whether the perception of a swarm is different from the actual technical reality of a swarm, whether that's offensively more impactful and has the ability to execute missions that a remotely operated swarm is not able to. A lot of it has to do with the state of the defense. Is the defense capable of targeting and hitting and disabling individually operated drones that are running together, or would it find it easier to disable them by hitting the core of them and then, thereby disabling everyone around? I think at this point, because we don't have those technical actual swarm capabilities, the defense has not evolved to attack them. So it kind of makes it a moot point to an extent. I can't say that whether, if we were actually witnessing those tech capabilities, whether it would be easier for the Ukrainians to target and take them out. We don't know, but as somebody mentioned earlier, a lot of this also hits on a psychological dimension, and seeing those capabilities has its own impact independent of the actual technical reality. And I think that's something that we often tend to discount, but nonetheless is actually quite important.
Very interesting. Thank you. Sam, I want to turn to you and sort of two kind of questions. First, why do you think specifically, though, that the Russians have turned to using more of these loitering munitions? Is it a sign that they're worried about their missile stockpiles? Or, as you were, I think, it was interesting to me the way that you talked about how this is really a sign of Russian adaptation. So I'm wondering what's driving that adaptation and these specific decisions around that.
Well, these are great questions. We have a limited sort of aperture into Russian decision-making right now. I should also caveat a lot of information that I'm using is from the open sources. And so looking at what is said publicly, stated publicly, is commented on or written in social media and other channels only gives us sort of part of the picture. I think Russian military understood well before the war of the significance of loitering munitions and combat UAVs. It observed Nagorno-Karabakh war probably with great shock and horror, as it basically took place at borders. And it recognized that some of the smaller countries now have the capability that only large states used to have. So I think adaptability is built into Russian militaries, as well as obviously Ukrainian militaries' capacity in this war, as each side tries to outmaneuver and outgun the other side. Once it becomes clear that a strategy isn't working, it shifts gears. I think it's very telling that Iran admitted that it shipped some of its drones to Russia before the war started. I think it's also telling that the majority of the Iranian drone deliveries took place in the first several months of the war, when Russia was still hoping to take Ukrainian territory with the use of their ground forces. And it is only really after the defeat around Kiev and in the Kharkiv region did Russia shift its strategy and try to force Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society to pay a very high price. I think this type of adaptability is built into the conflict of this size and this duration. We have to remind our audience that the Ukrainian front is very large. It is the largest military front since World War II, and a lot is happening there. And there are sections of the front which could be well defended by both Ukrainians and the Russians. And there are also very significant gaps. And Russia turning to loitering munitions is trying to exploit a gap and really size up and probe the Ukrainian air defense capabilities. But again, going after economic targets is part of the military strategy for Russia, trying to force the adversary to the negotiating table by inflicting a very heavy cost on the civilian population, if military strategy isn't necessarily working. And for Russia, a lot of things did not work as planned. And as they were rolling back across basically the entire front, they needed something to put a stop to the bleeding. And so they started using these loitering munitions, probably with a full understanding that not all of them are going to make it through, probably understanding that this relatively cheap system with civilian components is going to be relatively easy prey for Ukrainian integrated air defense. But then again, it only takes one or two of these loitering munitions to make it through and strike a Ukrainian power plant, generating a very significant cost, both for the military and the civilians. So I think we're going to expect Russians to use a similar strategy going forward as it tries to sort of shift its military industrial complex to meet some of the demands and some of the challenges that were brought about by Russia's conduct in this war.
Excellent, thank you. Tom, a question for you, which is, I've written quite a bit with my co-author, Max Bremer, about Ukraine's employment of an air denial strategy and the success they've had with that. And key to that being their ability to maintain an air defense in being. As you mentioned earlier, just the threat of that, keeps Russian aircraft largely at bay. And I'm wondering, you mentioned about the challenges of integration, given the different systems, as the Western countries are sending more systems. Are you concerned at all about the viability of the Ukrainian air defense in being? And, what are some of the challenges now for Ukraine as it's trying to replace those S-300s with other Western systems? And what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, emphatically, yes. And in some ways, this is why, while things appear to be good with the Ukrainian counteroffensives right now, this could easily turn into a longer war of attrition, whereby Russia is willing to lose many more and more people than Ukraine has to match. And so, this is where on the attrition side, it also goes to things like how many SAM rounds do you have? And are we going to run out? This is, again, big picture. Zelensky's number one thing, send me more air defenses of any kinds. To the first part of your question, yes, putting these things together is very tough. The United States of America has been putting out joint staff documents for a couple of decades now about why we need to have integrated air and missile defense, but it's really tough. And we don't really have the U.S. Army even talking to the U.S. Navy, talking to the Air Force. In fact, we don't even have U.S. Army systems that really talk to each other in terms of a single integrated air picture, let alone the more high-end integrated fire control kinds of things. We're getting there. We're getting to that nirvana slowly but surely. And the Guam Air and Missile Defense ginormous project is a huge forcing function for this. Let me say a couple other things here that I think really tie in with some of what Sam was saying is we need to make sure that nothing stands in the way. And I was really struck by his comment about the Bayraktars. Why was it that Turkish Bayraktars, one of the reasons why the Turkish Bayraktars were operating in the early days of the Ukrainian conflict and having ballads sung to their memory? Well, for one thing, the United States' own MTCR restrictions. We kind of got in our own way in terms of the ability to sell UAVs like that. And the Trump administration, to its credit, began to loosen that a little bit, but really, I would say far too little too late. And it's really unclear, I would say, whether even the loosening of the MTCR under the Trump administration has really been fully implemented. So we need a kind of Marie Kondo approach to arms control and arms transfers, be they Stingers, be they larger MTCR class things. And that is, if it no longer brings you joy, thank it for its service and send it on its way. We need to make sure nothing stands in the way of that. But one thing will stand in the way, and that's numbers, and that's supply. And this goes back to, do you have the thing to give them? And I'm going to tie up these couple threads here, which is say, we're paying the price, and Ukraine may soon pay a more acute price for several decades now, taking air superiority for granted. We can't click our heels 3 times and wish ourselves into an integrated air and missile defense force in being. It doesn't work that way. It takes time to develop this, and it takes time to build lots and lots of these things. when the US Army divested itself of the SHORAD mission in 2012, and then 5 years later comes back and says, oh my goodness, air and missile defense is needs to be in our top 5 modernization priorities because history is returned. That's taken time to field the first SHORAD units in Europe, I think just a year or so ago. So unfortunately, it's going to be a challenge. We're not going to be able to share, for instance, Patriots because they are such an amazingly scarce resource for the United States, and we have to deter other places, including from China. But I will identify one thing, and I'm really glad that Sam has been talking about the Iranian drones, and I would say there's a silver lining here. I've been really amazed at how the Israeli attitude on the conflict has gone from fence sitting to kind of the Mossad issuing press releases about their desire to share intel on these things and perhaps get a little target practice along the way. There is one system that the United States could share, but have not done so, and that's our Iron Dome systems. We don't need to take anything away from Israel for its own defense. The United States has 2 batteries of Iron Domes, and if, in a foreign policy standpoint, Israel were to greenlight the transfer of those from the United States to Ukraine, that would be a helpful addition. And I certainly hope that on a foreign policy standpoint, we not adopt any more half measures, and we don't let anything stand in the way of additional capacity transfers that we can do.
Great, thank you. Rita, I want to pick up on a little bit on something Tom said, which was, around the challenges of integrating these systems and the systems talking to each other, and ask you a little bit about that, given your background as an expert in artificial intelligence. And of course, that depends a lot, artificial intelligence, on the ability to have data that can talk across systems. And just ask you, as you're looking at this war, just thinking more generally, how do you see artificial intelligence being used in this war, particularly the air war, and what it might be telling us about the future military applications of AI, particularly in air warfare?
Sure. So the way that I've been thinking about the use of AI in this war is essentially admitting that it's unprecedented and it's significant, but it's nonetheless remains limited. We have to take into consideration that artificial intelligence, at least in its machine learning manifestation and the more advanced capabilities, is still very much a new technology that is not, for the most part, battle tested. And even in the US military, which arguably has the most advanced set of research and development and experimentation efforts going on related to AI, it is still very much in those stages, in the research, development, experimentation. Not much of it has been fielded, not much of it, especially the capabilities that are related to warfighting, have been, assured or tested or experimented with in battlefield conditions, and the absolute majority of them are not battle ready. What we're seeing Ukraine do very, very effectively is the ability to use commercial technology for battlefield operations. And that's where we've seen companies like Primer AI, for instance, which has become one of the principal examples for using artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms for battlefield information processing. There's been several articles in the media talking about how this company, Primer AI, has either donated or allowed Ukraine to use some of its systems to capture, analyze, transcribe, and translate Russian military communications on the battlefield, and to glean insights from there, and to then obviously use that information for their plans and their targeting. So that's been really fascinating, but that's a commercial first capability. When we're thinking about the integration of AI into things like air warfare, and that's across the gamut of, with electronic warfare to then actual air to, whether it's ground to air or air to air striking capabilities, that is for the most part, and perhaps exclusively, is a military capability with really not a lot of equivalent in the commercial sector. So that is it's a different problem set that commercial technology doesn't really address for obvious reasons, that it simply doesn't really exist in the commercial space. So progress in that area is inevitably going to be slower, or at least slower to transition, because a lot of the breakthroughs come from the commercial sector when it comes to AI and machine learning, and governments and militaries have been, kind of a distant second. So the things that Ukraine has done very effectively with AI thus far has been predominantly inspired and acquired from the commercial sector as opposed to developed in the military space. So I think that is going to kind of influence where they go forward using AI and some of the lessons that we can learn as well.
Excellent, Sam. I'll ask you the last question, then we're going to turn to the audience questions. But Sam, we've been talking a lot about Ukrainian capabilities and Ukrainian air defense systems, but of course the Russians have their own air defenses and very robust ones, layered air defenses. And I was just wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit of a picture about how the Russians are doing with their air defense systems, particularly in the East, and how they have adapted their employment, particularly in trying to defend against Ukrainian airborne threats.
Russia has a number of air defense systems in the field. They've actually displayed them well before the war. And we've also seen evidence of some of these systems falling prey to Ukrainian attacks on social media, so we can actually form a good picture, or relatively good picture, of what Russia uses. Russian media also confirms, along with plenty of social media content, that it's using S-200, S-300 systems. It's using Pantsir, it's using Tor and Buk air defense systems. In fact, Tor and Buk are cited as two of the best systems to handle Ukrainian drones, according to the Russians. Of course, in conjunction with these air defense systems, there's a lot of layered electronic warfare defense systems as well. And Russia claims, at least in its social media and open sources, that it's using at least half a dozen different types of EW systems against Ukrainian advanced assets like aircraft, missiles, and drones. And it's using anything from large systems like Krasukha and Borisogledsk to Belina, Tirada, Palantin, and multiple other systems. Russians are also claiming to use a number of handheld counter-UAS rifles in the field. We've seen some social media evidence of those to go after some of the smaller Ukrainian aerial assets like commercial drones, although there's no evidence of this mass-scale application of these counter-UAS EW rifles in the Russian military yet. So again, I want to mention that the Ukrainian front is very large, and there are assets that the Russians are able to cover very well. And there are other assets, especially forward operating tactical units, which cannot be fully covered by either air defense or EW, which is why we're seeing so many commercial drone videos showing attacks on Russian targets. It is probably not possible for a military force of the size that's currently fighting on the Russian side to have a full 100% coverage, air defense and EW, against adversarial threats. And this is probably one of the biggest lessons from this war that the United States and other countries are drawing, that the proliferation of different types of threats that can target long range, short range, and mid range, especially threats from commercial technologies, force the militaries to adapt rather quickly. And using legacy systems that Russia is using today isn't always possible to provide 100% coverage. But again, if you look at the sentiment in the Russian media, they're saying that everything is fine with respect to their air defense and EW, and it's the Ukrainians which are actually hurting and are on the defensive because of Russian attacks by both missiles and loading munitions. So going forward into the winter, we're going to have Russians pull up more air defense and EW systems, try to integrate them in a layered defensive fashion. Now that nearly 8 months have passed and a lot of lessons were drawn by the Russians about how Ukrainians intend to attack and how Ukrainians attack their positions, these lessons are probably going to be incorporated in Russian air defense and electronic warfare concepts, tactics, and operations.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to try to get as many of these questions as we can. So I'll just ask if you guys could keep your responses, if possible, as brief in answering them. but we have an interesting question here, which is about what are the Russians learning with regard to the use of crewed helicopter assets for ground support? Sam, I think that's probably a question for you.
Well, I'll actually mention a report that just came out from our counterparts in RUSI, Royal United Services Institute. They published a very extensive report on Russian use of air power in Ukraine, and they actually described how Russian helicopter attacks have evolved away from daytime more to nighttime and close support operations. But it is very dangerous still for the Russian helicopter crews to operate, considering the proliferation of close range, short range air defensive systems in the Ukrainian military that can target these helicopters with relative ease. And so Russians are probably going to learn from that and try to use their remaining and existing helicopter assets based on these very bloody lessons learned. And so I would invite your audience to turn to that excellent RUSI report on Russian use of air power in the war.
Kelly, you're on mute.
Thank you. An interesting question here about air superiority. Noting that, the Russians, we're not able to give air superiority early in the war, and thinking about a parallel to the Battle of Britain, that the Luftwaffe turned to night bombing in London, in part because they gave up on gaining air superiority. And is this move to sort of uncrewed strikes and a Russian acknowledgement that they simply cannot gain air superiority in Ukraine? Is that what drove this change? And relatedly, is there any reason to think that the Russians might be reassessing their approach to siege or suppression of enemy air defenses and ISR in the near future? I don't know who might want to answer that.
I'll jump in really quickly to say, the comments that I made in the beginning, perhaps not the most articulate, but the evolution of the Air Force is a reflection of the evolution of the war in general, including the lessons learned from the failure to achieve those strategic ambitions early on, whether through this foiled attempt to quickly take Kiev on the ground, or the strategic bombardment. It is a response to failing to do so, and it is, like Sam said in the beginning, an adaptation. I wouldn't go too far with the comparison to the World War II attack on Britain, because we're also witnessing a significant ground campaign that's integrated with those air attacks, and that matters for a variety of reasons. So that's something to keep in mind.
Hey, Kelly, can I jump in on this? I think, and also to what Sam was saying earlier, which is, everybody's looking at this new UAS phenomenon, and well, how do we have the counter UAS thing? And again, big picture, the biggest challenge is, number one, that we have just taken air superiority for granted. That has fed into the secondary problem of the counter UAS capability not being where it needs to be. And now everybody's scrambling there. But I'd like to suggest a little bit of a paradigm shape here, which is that I predict it was not going to be too much longer before we stop talking about them with this really unfortunate acronym UASs, which is to say, when you think about the specific characteristics of these things, they're either going fast or going slow. They're either operating on aerodynamic principles in terms of lift and propulsion, or something else. And I think we're going to see what is already a fairly rich and diverse and uninterrupted air and missile threat spectrum only intensify. And so I really just think that the fundamental principle of counter UAS is part of air defense. That may seem self-evident here, and maybe why are you even saying this? But it has very substantial, I would say, operational and investment and training implications for the United States and for other folks. These things are going to be ubiquitous. They already are to some extent over Ukraine, for instance. And as Sam mentioned, we've seen them in lots of other conflicts like Nagorno-Karabakh. So just watch that space. I think this is important to foot stomp that counter UAS is part of air defense, and it needs to be thought of as such. And to Sam's point that the Russians have lots of layered air defenses, yes, indeed. My colleague at CSIS, Ian Williams, likes to say that if U.S. air defenses are like an avocado, the Russians are more like an onion. They've got lots of them. Why? Because they didn't take air superiority for granted in the way that we have, and we're scrambling to catch up.
Excellent. So we're almost out of time, but we have a really excellent question from an audience member that I think actually is wonderful for sort of ending, which is, when you look at the war, a lot of the things that we're seeing with both the employment of uncrewed systems and missiles sort of fits sort of trends that precede the war. But is there any sort of technical or tactical innovation in this war that has surprised you the most that you might be able to emphasize for the audience or highlight? Sam, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's something I've actually been tweeting about for months at this point, and that is the bottom-up pressure exerted on the Russian military and a relatively organic integration of this technology on the Ukrainian side in using commercial quadcopters for providing tactical intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. There is absolutely no way to overvalue or underestimate this. It has been an absolutely incredible technological product, even though it seems entirely logical that given the evolution of UAS technologies in general, military should be integrating a small tactical UAV at the platoon and company level to provide them with reconnaissance capability and further integrating this technology into the larger battalion and division size structure. But this was absent on the Russian side, despite earlier claims by the military that they were integrating them beginning with 2019. A lot of Russian volunteers have forced this development really on the Russian military, and it is now used by both the Donbass militias as well as Russian military itself. The mobilized forces are getting slowly but surely trained on this technology, considering that it has been called probably the biggest and best evolution of artillery since World War I, if artillery is paired with these commercial quadcopter technologies. And of course, on the Ukrainian side, this was a much better organized, better integrated effort, much smoother transition from commercial to military technology, and Ukrainians were using them with great success before Russians started using them on a mass scale. So this is the application of commercial technology for the military, and it is something that's driving a lot of tactical lessons, both on the Russian and the Ukrainian side, and especially for the United States and the NATO militaries, which are looking how such technology could be not only integrated into their own force structure, but how militaries, militias, and fighters can quickly adapt commercial technology to military applications with relatively great success.
Excellent, thank you. Rita?
Yeah, just building on that, I think there's a broader kind of a takeaway here, and it's about the blurred lines that are essentially disappearing. We're watching a large-scale conventional war between two independent states, and that's something that we haven't seen in a relatively long time, especially at this scale. And at the same time, we are seeing a lot of asymmetrical methods and this kind of, again, blurring lines between conventional and unconventional means and strategies and accomplishments. And what Sam was saying, the use of commercial technologies quite effectively in a very, old school kind of a conventional confrontation of a military to military. So I think with the United States having spent the last 20 years in what is best defined perhaps an unconventional asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency, counterterrorism operations, the lessons learned from that should absolutely not be discounted and brushed aside simply because we have now entered the era of, strategic competition and confrontation potentially with near peer countries. So absolutely hold on to those counterinsurgency manuals and don't just simply put them aside, because the lessons learned and the blurred lines, they're very much here.
Excellent, thank you. Tom?
I'll be quick, but 5 things to rattle off, all of them applying to deterring China. 1, morale and resolve. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun here for any of these things, but that without that, nothing else would have happened. 2, combined arms, both the failures on the Russian side and likewise on the Ukrainian side. 3rd, dispersed operations, right? Distributed operations. That's perhaps one of the newer things in relative terms that we've seen to great success to complicate others' fires. 4, just again, to reiterate the demand for air defense. It shouldn't be new, but again, given the decades of taking air superiority for granted, it's relatively new. And finally, mass. Back to my recommendation that we need to adopt and not be afraid of a strategic munitions reserve, producing more munitions than we quote unquote think we need. Those are fundamental principles, they're perennial principles, but we're seeing them, we're seeing reminders about them here anew. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much to our panelists this morning. This was a fascinating conversation. I know I certainly learned a lot. Thank you very much to our audience as well for tuning in and also for the excellent questions. I just want to remind everyone to please check out the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program here at Stimson, including the War in the 21st Century program that is looking at how the character of war is changing in this new century. Thank you again.